down. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. A very, very warm welcome. As you know, this is our first ever National Hedgerow Week, and this is one of our series of webinars we've been running this week. And a special welcome to our Tree Council supporters and any voluntary tree wardens we've got joining us today. So my name is Louise Bow. I'm Close the Gap Project Manager at the Tree Council, and I've got my colleague Dom on today as well, who's helping with all the IT side. And we've got our two wonderful speakers who I'll introduce in a minute. For those of you who are new to the Tree Council, we're a national charity and we work to bring people together for the love of trees. Now, National Hedgerow Week and these Hedge Talks webinars are part of a bigger Close the Gap project that we're running this year with 5 other charity partners. Close the Gap is funded by DEFRA through the government's Green Recovery Challenge Fund, and the objective of the programme is to help towards more, bigger, bushier, healthier hedgerows across the nation, not just in rural areas in the countryside, but also in towns and cities, recognising all the amazing things that hedgerows do for us. There's lots of different strands to the Close the Gap project that we're delivering with our partners, but some of the key ones are that we're going to be planting 53 kilometres of brand new hedgerows this year, 32 miles in old money, almost 2,500 new hedgerow trees that we're going to be planting. We're helping to share knowledge and research on hedgerow management. We're improving the surveying of hedgerows with a new hedgerow app that's going to be launched, and we're supporting the development of community seed nurseries to help bring on the plants for the hedgerows of the future. Now, Hedgerow Week itself is all around raising awareness of the public around hedgerows, about all the things that they can do in terms of biodiversity and climate change and air pollution, lots of different benefits, and we're going to hear about that in a few minutes. They tend to be the unsung heroes when it comes to habitats, so this week is all about trying to help work towards changing that. So I'm really, really happy to welcome our first speaker, Tiana Blanusa, who's the Principal Horticultural Scientist at the Royal Horticultural Society. Tiana leads the Ecosystem Services Research Programme at the RHS, and her research provides information to gardeners about the beneficial effects of plants in their gardens to both themselves and the wider environment. And she hopes it will encourage people, all of us, to keep as much of our gardens as green as possible. So with that, Tiana, I'll let you make a start. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Louise. And it's wonderful to see that so many people are interested in this topic. I will start sharing my screen. I have about 20-25 minutes of kind of an update of the research that we have been doing on hedgerows over the last few years.
Just a quick practical point actually to our viewers. If you have any questions at all, if you put those in the Q&A section, that would be really helpful because it helps us to keep tabs on the questions. And then any other sort of general comments and chat and things, obviously feel free to put that in the chat function. But if we can put the questions in the Q&A, it just helps us to find them quicker later on. Thank you.
Good. So shall I get going?
Yeah, off you go. Great.
So as Louise said, I'm a principal scientist at the RHS. For those, I mean, I suspect a lot of you will be aware of the RHS. If we were all in a room together, I'd probably have a show of hands and ask how many of you were RHS members. And I guess a lot of you would be familiar with our flagship gardens, Weasley, our flagship flower show, Chelsea. Shameless plug here about our latest garden that's just opened a couple of weeks ago up in Manchester, RHS Garden Bridgewater, and also maybe something that some of you may be less aware of, the fact that we have quite a large and growing science department, and I'm part of that science department. We actually are getting a new home, RHS Weasley Hilltop, a new center for horticultural science and learning, which is opening in 3 weeks' time in Weasley. So, with that now sort of being out in the open, I just wanted to start with the formal part of the lecture. So I'm a plant biologist, a plant physiologist, and I'm interested in the services that various types of plants and green infrastructure in our gardens and more widely, what they do for us. As an RHS scientist, I'm obviously interested in the domestic realm, and particularly urban domestic realm, and that's because 87% of us in the UK have domestic gardens. Most of those gardens are urban. According to the last census, most of UK residents are urban residents. Gardens do take an awful lot of domestic, of urban footprint. It depends, city to city, but nationally, anywhere between 20 to 25% of every town and city in the UK is covered by domestic green gardens, domestic gardens. Not all of it is green, unfortunately, but we're trying to make sure that as much as possible of that domestic footprint is green. A very recent survey that we've done just before Christmas, asking various environmental questions, showed us that 40% of sort of respondents nationally have a hedge in the UK. So it suggests to us that we have quite a large potential. There's a lot of us have gardens, a lot of us have hedges in our gardens and other greenery. What we grow and how we manage those green spaces can have quite a significant environmental impact. And the kinds of things we're up against would be known to all of you. We are facing excess heat, localized flooding, aerial pollution, noise, loss of biodiversity, name it. A lot of things are going wrong for us in cities because we are paving, sealing surfaces, and that causes us all sorts of troubles. So plants are one of the tools that we have at our disposal to help, but they're not a cure for everything. The extent of cover is very important. The choice of species, we also, so how much we have of something, what we choose to plant and how we decide to manage it and maintain it is going to determine how impactful it is, how positive it can be then for us. So I'm going to sort of begin to introduce you to the world of the research behind these sort of, us trying to solve these problems. So I often use this slide, and I often say that, if this was the only slide I was allowed to show, then, this would be it, which kind of summarizes my thinking around these sets of problems around plants in urban environment and the environmental benefits they provide. We know that plants can provide a number of benefits, and we often as scientists study them individually. So we are measuring how plants affect air temperatures, or they trap pollutants, or capture rainfall, enhance biodiversity, you name it, a number of things that plants do. What actually happens is that they provide many simultaneous benefits. We might be studying them individually, but if you have a tree there, it will be doing all of these things all at the same time. So I think for us to be aware and sort of appreciate plants for this multiplicity benefits is something that we are striving towards. The second thing that is kind of at my kind of back of my mind when I'm researching is this sort of idea of wanting to test how much plants differ in the extent of service of provision of these services. Different plants cool to different extents. You have very, I'll go into the detail of it later, but you have plants that are very active and plants which are less active. Do they provide the same benefits? Plants that grow faster, plants that go slower, have different types of canopies, root systems, and so on. And also not just, understanding how plants differ, but at which scales those differences matter. So if you planted them in your garden, what difference would it make as, whether you decided to go for a group of plants A as opposed to a group of plants Z. So here just really a choice of some images to show you, the scales at which we do our research, the techniques we use. Some of these images would be from Hedges here, doing some rainfall application. I will go into a lot more detail of that later, but we also, are measuring, for example, energy exchange around, plant surfaces, temperatures, humidity, pollutant capture, soil moisture, all sorts of things. What we are trying to do is, because obviously we are not able to test every species and variety going, RHS Plant Finder has tens of thousands of species and varieties. So in our quest to try and recommend the species and varieties that are likely to have biggest positive environmental impacts, we are actually testing plants which are representative of certain traits, and we are trying to identify which traits that plants have are linked to better delivery of certain benefits. And to that end, we have been looking, I mean, a number of my PhD students, students that I have supervised over the last decades, have sort of looked at those issues. So, for example, we have looked at, which traits are required for good cooling. And then we've identified, basically thirsty plants, light leaf color, presence of leaf hairs, large leaf areas. Those are all the characteristics you want in your plants if you want them to cool. This was a project on green roofs. Then we also looked at, what do you need for good rainfall capture? And again, a set of traits was identified. What do we need for good trapping of particulates, airborne sort of dusts and dirt? Presence of hairs and rough surfaces, large leaf areas. So we have begun to identify what traits are needed. And then now we're trying to see how they link and what is the overlap in terms of traits, for any form of green infrastructure. Now, going specifically towards hedges, we've decided maybe 5 or 6 years ago at the RHS to start this internally funded project, which has really sort of grown and grown, to use hedges as a model to try and understand which services are best delivered, which when I say services, it's these sort of issues I've mentioned earlier, the cooling, air quality, rainfall, capture, carbon, sort of removal, biodiversity support, and so on. So what services are well provided by hedges and what traits underpin them? And the reason why we've chosen hedges as model is because they are compact. So, in urban settings can be applied or retrofitted reasonably easily, or at least more easily than trees or some other forms of green infrastructure. They are linear, which is good for certain air quality issues. So, they are actually a good screen without trapping the pollution or, aggravating pollution issues. They're cheap, and we know they're already widely used. So we wanted to understand this sort of resource, which was quite prevalent in British urban and suburban settings, describe it, see what's already known about it, and then also identify what are any possible gaps in research. So we started first with this literature review, which, obviously, please don't panic and try and read all of this all at the same time. The summaries of this slide would be in RHS, on RHS advice pages, links here, and the full paper is in this link. But basically what we have sort of done, we have looked at over 40 species and varieties which are commonly grown in the UK, gone through science literature, checked it through and through up until 2019, and seen what's kind of available from literature to tell us about particulate capture. So that's the capture of airborne particulate matter. It's basically dust that's floating about in the air, about noise reduction, about rainfall, rain capture, about wildlife. We've also looked at a few other things, but those were the key ones. We were trying to see what are the desirable features that a hedge should have to deliver particulate capture, to reduce noise, to so on, and then what are the examples of the species that deliver it. So we know that, for example, to capture particles from the air, we want large and dense canopies, we want smaller leaves, we want hairy leaves, or scaly and rough leaves. Those are the kinds of characteristics that would provide good capture of particulates, or as we call them in science, PM, particulate matter. And these are some examples of the species that would do that. For example, for rainfall attenuation, it would be large leaf areas, thirsty plants which have high transpiration rates. Those are the characteristics that are linked with better rainfall attenuation. And then the kind of the species which would do that we found were like hawthorn, forsythia, cotoneaster, some privets, and so on. We have in our review focused mainly on services, on positive things that hedges do, but we have also in sort of checking those science databases, come across some negative issues that can be associated. And these three, allergenicity, invasiveness, and intensive management, are the key issues that we've spotted as potential problems with hedges. So it's not to say that necessarily, hornbeams, Carpinus vetulus, or Fagus, that's beech, or Thuya or Cyprus shouldn't be planted, but for example, they should perhaps be avoided in situations where you are, maybe having vulnerable individuals that are allergic to pollen, or hedges could be managed in a way that sort of reduces the risk of an issue, either perhaps planting female cultivars if that's possible, or pruning at the times before they come into flower so that allergenic pollen is not disseminated. Another thing which clearly, obviously, in public debate is very important is avoiding invasive species in some context. Currently, our view is that in the urban setting, most of the species that are currently, that we have investigated should not, none of them obviously are on the official invasive list, but some like Cotoneaster or Prunus lacerasus can have invasive characteristics, and because they are disseminated by birds, their seeds are disseminated by birds, they could clearly spread. But in city centers, the kind of potential for spread is smaller than if you live in suburban areas. So again, if you live on an edge where you're sort of backing off onto a field, the question of invasiveness becomes more important for you than for somebody who lives in central London and wants to put in a micro hedge. And then obviously, management, even though it's not a service or the service as such, environmentally, because of its indirect impacts and the use of fuels and so on, also needs to be considered in the choice of species. So that was kind of the theoretically what we've seen, that there's already an awful lot in the literature that enables us to make some general conclusions about the traits which are favorable and the species that represent them. But there were clearly also gaps, and we've gone over the last couple of years and sort of done some specific research ourselves, looking at hedges in rainfall capture and then also hedges in particle pollutant capture. And I'll just sort of talk you through those two areas in the last 5 minutes or so of my talk. So when it comes to the rainfall experiments, what we have done, what we have noticed in the literature is that a lot of it is really on very small number of species, and generally on rural hedgerows. It's basically 2 or 3 species. And then there's also information we could extrapolate from forest research on trees, when some species that can be hedges are grown as trees. But what we have done is we have extended the range. So we've looked at 7 species or even more, I think, species in cultivars. We looked at evergreen and deciduous, coniferous and broadleaves. We've done experiments, of individual plants and sort of groupings of plants which were hedge-like. We could, rained on them in controlled manner and looked at how much they delay runoff, what's the volume they can store in the canopy, what's the volume or extent of the sort of runoff reduction in the soil. And the reason why we were interested in that is because we know in the urban context that the increase of ceiling surfaces really increases flooding risks, because water doesn't have anywhere to go. Our drainage systems are old. Any help we can provide them by slowing down the flow and retaining that water on the canopies or in the soil and losing it back to the atmosphere is helpful. And we just wanted to understand what's the capacity of different hedge species which have different root, canopy, leaf, functional characteristics to do that. And I'll sort of update you with the results later. We have found the species differences and we have found what traits are required. And then when it comes to air quality, we have looked at we've tested greater number of species for kind of flood mitigation, and then just taken kind of 3 of the front runners, the thuyas, that's Western Red Cedar, Hawthorn, and Cotoneaster. They were our best species that sort of were linked with reduction of rainfall runoff. And then we've planted them in 3 locations in Reading, where I am based, with high, low, and no traffic, to look at the impact of species, but also volume of traffic on the capture of PM, particulate matter, onto the leaf surfaces. And then we did very sort of simple experimentation where plants were exposed to traffic. We just collected leaves, washed them, and weighed them. So gravimetrically, we determined how much weight of particles in various class sizes. We were doing sequential filtration, and basically just measured what is caught on each of these types of leaves. And then in terms of what we have found, first, in terms of rainfall reduction, we found that large canopies with small leaves mitigated rainfall even when substrate was fully saturated. So even when you have very little or no storage capacity in the soil, just having a canopy there with these large canopy with small, generally oval leaves, you have quite a significant storage capacity over that area. The delay of runoff when you have a hedge as opposed to bare soil can be significant. So we've had in our experiments up to 20 minutes delay. So rain starts falling. If you just have bare soil, within 5 minutes the water begins to leak. If you have a hedge growing on top of it, you have further 15 to 20 minutes where you're buying yourself time in terms of the kind of drains being able to manage. And then we generally found that plants with higher transpiration rates, which means plants which are thirstier, which use more water, they provide better rainfall attenuation. I suppose that's unsurprising, but it was just something that we have confirmed. And then in terms of the capture of particulate matter, there were species differences. So, our hawthorn was, for example, capturing least particulate matter, and our cotoneaster and thuya were capturing more. But this difference in capture really was only measurable in the situation of high traffic locations. When we compared the species in low traffic scenarios or no traffic scenarios, species differences were minimal, which is kind of an interesting thing. I suppose it means that practically, if you live on a very busy road, then what you plant would really have an impact and could increase. If you plant a more efficient plant, could provide some additional benefit for you. But if you live in the cul-de-sac, bordering a green belt, then really you can be a lot more relaxed about what you plant. And I think in terms of sort of general advice, or what do I plant? I think that the issue is probably to think about what's the prevalent problem that you are trying to solve. So if you live on a very noisy, polluted roads, you would be picking plants off that list, with good performance for those services that you will have seen earlier in one of my slides. If you live in an area where it's generally clean and you have no pressing environmental issues, then you would just go with some good general all-rounders. And from our research, the likes of holly and hawthorn and privet have come up as sort of quite good, just general all-rounders, which would do quite a number of things well, even if they're not excelling at any particular one. So I think at this point, I'm going to finish. I just wanted to sort of leave with very short slide of thanks to many people who have contributed to this research over the years. And I'm happy to obviously take any questions, and I've left my email at the bottom if anyone had any questions after the talk. So I will stop sharing. And actually, yes, I think Louise probably pass on to John.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Shona. That was brilliant. So yeah, any questions anybody has, if you put them in the Q&A, and we'll pick those up at the end of when we've had both speakers. That was great. So our next speaker, very happy to welcome one of my colleagues, John Stokes, who is the Director of Trees, Science and Research at the Tree Council, where he's been working on the conservation and protection of trees for over 30 years, including that he helped found the National Tree Warden Scheme, which is still going strong, originally started in Leicestershire, and he's been working closely with tree wardens across the country ever since then. So John, you're ready to start sharing and take your mute off. Brilliant. Over to you, John.
Are we sharing now? No, I haven't started yet. There we go.
Not quite. There we go. Just about. There we go. It's coming up now.
All right. Afternoon, everybody.
We've just got John. So you haven't got your slides at the moment. We've got your desktop.
Oh, intriguing. The wonders of modern technology. In the old days, you used to mess up and drop a slide projector. These days, you just can't work out which bit of the screen you're supposed to be showing. And I ought to know better.
That's okay. Just while you're finding that, anyone who... Oh, there we go. Off you go then. Yeah, fab.
Now, go on.
Yeah, that's it. I was just going to fill in a bit.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tiana. What was suggested was that we would then follow the science with some practicality. And what does that mean? As Tiana said, what does that mean to you in terms of practice and what you do? So let's just start at the beginning. People have had hedges as long as we've lived here. They might have been different sorts of hedges, but 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, archaeological evidence showed that around our homes, we had forms of hedges. We had them to manage our stock, we had them to manage our spaces, we had them to protect us from the world at large. And when the Romans arrived, they changed that slightly because they introduced the concept of the garden, a space that wasn't functional, but a space that was beautifying and gave us something that we could sit in. And so the garden came along after the hedge. And the landscape was created with lots of hedges in it, but then we started to build our homes in the places that were hedged. And so these lovely hedges that we had across the countryside were incorporated into our towns and our cities. And they show up in people's back gardens, they show up in the streets, in the structure of towns and cities. And we often don't know that they're there as part of that history of our landscape. We often don't understand that they are part of both the countryside and the city. They are that bit of fossilization of the old world in the new. And so those hedges become important. They are really important parts of the structure of the countryside and of the town. And then we've created the modern hedges that Tiana's been talking about, those new hedges that we've planted since to follow on that tradition, to mark our boundaries, to mark the edges of our spaces. Now, historically, we used to have hedges as fox hunting jumps. And fox hunting jumps needed a very specific sort of management. You cut them into boxes, into shapes, into fox hunting jumps. And then we've carried on that tradition of cutting our hedges into boxes in the countryside, but in the town also. And I do wonder why. I still have a real problem with why we do something that we've always done, just because we've always done it. And the problem with keep cutting it is that you reduce the flowers, you reduce the opportunities for wildlife, you reduce all sorts of things. So we need to start thinking about how we stop cutting hedges into nice square clipped boxes, because nice square clipped boxes, well, they're all right, but they don't bring all the opportunities that you could have out of a nice hedge. It's a clipped box. It's nice, but it's not that exciting and perhaps not that interesting. And in a street scene, it matters that we start thinking about doing it properly. And I wouldn't recommend that anybody gets to this level of hedge management. But this was actually, and this is honestly true, this was sent to us by the Irish Hedgelaying Association, who said they could not believe that this form of hedge management was being done in Northern Ireland. It's not good. It's not great practice. And the thing that really scares me is if you look, the wires actually go under the crane. So how, I have no idea how we ever got there, but don't ever do that. But do think about how you manage your hedge and try to think, if you're going to keep it in shape, can we do something creative? Can we do something that's a bit more adventurous with the way we manage the shape, rather than just cutting it into a clipped box? Because if you do something a bit more adventurous, you make that hedge a bit more of the street, a bit more of the scene, a bit more of that urban landscape. And yes, you can have it as a clip box, but maybe just a little bit more adventurous. And why any of that matters is the more you clip it, the less there are flowers. And there's lots of science and research that's been done by Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, CEH, who did 5 years of looking at hedges, monitoring the flowers under all sorts of cutting regimes, where we looked at how often you cut them and when you cut them to try and see what happened to the flowers and to the fruit. And it became immediately apparent, which is obvious to all of us if you think about it, that if you cut a hedge too often, you cut away the flowers, you cut away the opportunities for fruit, and that reduces the value of that hedge to wildlife. So the best cutting regime for flowers and for fruit seems to be on every 2 or 3 years. So you cut it not every year, but every other year or every couple of years to try and keep the flowers, to keep the wildlife, to keep the opportunities in that hedge. And that's true in rural areas as it is in urban areas. And so our tips, there are tips that come from the research and they follow on from Tiana's information earlier. And we thought we would give you a few top tips for how to look after your hedges in urban areas. So the first one is to not cut the hedge too often or too tight. Allowing the flowers to develop means that you get fruit, means that you get wildlife, means that you get the opportunities for the countryside to move into the towns. And you know, if you can't cut it every couple of years because you just can't, then maybe you can cut one side, maybe you can cut the other side, maybe you can leave the top. There are opportunities to not cut everything into that clipped box all the time. So tip number 1, don't cut too often and don't cut too tight. Tip number 2 is to think about when you cut it. Cut at the right time. If you have to cut it, why would you cut it today? Why would you cut it in May or June or July when the flowers are there? Why would you cut it in September and August when there is fruit on these hedges? Cut them when the flowers aren't there, when the fruit aren't there, because if that happens, you get greater opportunities for animals and wildlife to use your hedges. And ideally, if you have to cut it in the winter. But don't cut it back to the same point. If you left an inch or 2 on the width of your hedge every year, if you have to cut it every year because of space or whatever, leave an inch or 2 or 3 each year, and that will allow the flowers to develop in that second year wood, because most of these species flower on second year wood. And if you cut it back to the same point every year, you will not get the flowers. You will just have a dense but potentially quite boring, in my view, hedge that doesn't provide some of the other opportunities that you can get. As Tiana said, choice of species matters. We should be encouraging, if possible, native shrubs, or possibly, as Tiana said, the right shrub for the right place. Now, we like native because native increases the wildlife. But as Tiana said, choosing the right species for your place matters. Get the right shrub or that's doing the job you want to do. But then think about diversifying them. The more diversity you have in your hedge, the better, because diversity offers opportunity for different species and other animals to move into your home. So diversity matters. Mix it up a bit. Have as many species as you can in that hedge. And think carefully about what you're choosing, because as you saw, Louise's eyes shot up then. Choosing the wrong species can be costly, can be expensive, can be really difficult to manage. And they start young, and the garden centre will sell it to you as a fast-growing species. Well, what a fast-growing species means, it's going to keep going upwards. And the classic of that is Leyland Cyprus, which people will sell you Leyland Cyprus hedges, and they tell you they'll make a nice thick hedge after 5 or 6 years. But nobody knows how tall they can get. There is the largest Leyland Cyprus in the country are 140 feet tall. And if you don't keep managing the top, it will go up and up and up. And because they've only existed since 1880, because they were a natural hybrid that happened in Wales, we genuinely don't know how tall they might get. So if you plant a nice Leyland Cyprus hedge, it'd be great for 5 or 10 years. But if you lose control of the top, you might have 200 feet of hedge in 20, 30, 50, 100 years time. And you might not be able to manage that. So make sure you pick the right species because otherwise you will have really high hedges, and that causes problems with your neighbours. And I loved the picture on the left, which we saw in Kent once, where the only way that family could actually see out of their garden was that they had to cut windows in their hedge so that they could see out, which I don't know, it's up to them. Tip number 4, keep it thick, keep it dense, because the management does have a value, which is that it keeps the internal structure of the hedge thick. You don't want to cut back every year to the same point, as I've already said, but keeping some sort of management causes the branches to intertwine, causes the hedge to thicken up, and that gives wonderful opportunities for birds to nest. Things like robins and finches will use those hedges because of that density of structure. And as Tiana said, again, you can, if you've got a species in your allergenic, one of the things that you might do is your hornbeam hedge, if you suddenly discover that you've got an allergy, removing the flowers for that specific purpose may be beneficial. So again, keeping it thick and dense will reduce those flowers. Although, unless you're really allergic, I would say have the flowers, because then you get the fruit. And look after the trees and shrubs, and put in some new trees. In any urban area, the hedges matter. And we've discovered from research that one big hawthorn in a hedge that's allowed to flower provides the flowers of nearly 200 meters of clipped hedgerow. It's a massively beneficial thing. So in any urban area, the trees in those hedgerows matter. They matter because they provide that opportunity for that big third dimension that gives the wildlife the opportunity to move through the towns and cities. Bats really hate it if there's more than a 20-meter gap between them. So if you have some trees, the bats can navigate happily through the corridors, along the townscape, finding their way through your gardens. And even small trees like holly and rowans and crabapples will provide huge opportunities for wildlife in any urban space. And we want you to think about linking up the hedges. There are so many edges, so many boundaries to our urban places that could have hedges, fence lines, on the edges of streets, not just your gardens, but all of these spaces where linking up through planting hedges can really make a difference. And here's one that we did a few years ago in North London, where we planted along that palisade fencing. We created that border, that created that screen. We took away some of those pollutions that you've heard Tiana talking about. And we've allowed the wildlife to move through those spaces. And that has given that place a much better feel. It's given that place a much better landscape, and it's made the place richer because it's got a hedge. So what we don't want to see is that. I hate boring fences when you could have something green and living and growing in its place. And look at opportunities like this, where we've got fences with a space inside where there could be a really nice hedge, where there could be something that was environmentally beneficial and positively gave, value to that space, instead of just sitting there as a, well, let's be honest, a boring slab of grass with one tree in it. A hedge around that space would make a huge difference. So we've given you some tips, but in the end, it's about how you manage your spaces and how you manage those edges that you're close to. And hedges can be a whole range of things. So I was thinking of some sort of snappy one-liners to try and make it real. So bolster the borders, make those borders bushier, make them have life, make them bigger hedges, allow them a little bit of growth. Beautify your boundaries, plant things along the edges that can add color, can add some wildlife value, some shape, some color to your landscape, and hedge your edges, because there are great opportunities for urban hedges. They do provide homes for wildlife. They can make your space more beautiful. They do help to clean the air that we live in, and they make urban life simply better. And if that isn't a reason enough, just think about what we might do for the climate. And we've worked out that if you wanted to, the Climate Change Committee said, if we're going to make the UK climate resistant, we need to plant 200,000 kilometres of new hedge across Britain, where there's 67 million people, give or take, across the country. And if you divide 200,000 kilometres by 67 million, you get 3 metres of hedge per person is what we need to plant to get to our climate change committee. And if you've got 3 metres of space, fill it, plant it, put some hedge into your space. And that might be a space that you control, or it might be a space that you have access to. So this is a school, and this is a Blue Peter. This is like Blue Peter in the old days. This is one we did earlier. This is a school in Portsmouth where we planted a hedge along the edge of the playground there in 2015. And that's that hedge in 2018, which has already screened that school, allowed those children to get away from the noise and pollution of the street, given some privacy to that space, and allowed the opportunity for the young people to have an environment that is better, cleaner, greener, and more attractive. So if you can't plant your space for whatever reason, pledge a hedge. The idea of this whole campaign is to generate the funds that we can give away, opportunities for people to plant hedges. So it's not the only reason for this campaign, but it's definitely one of the things that we can do. And we want people to think about the space, your space, and do something with it to put a hedge back along the boundary of your land. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. That was great. Lots of good tips there, practical things that we can all do if we have access to managing a hedge, whether on our property, where we live, or where we work, or whatever. So if anyone's got any questions, we've got a few coming in the Q&A. I'll start looking at those in a sec, but yeah, if anyone's got any other questions, if you put them in there, that would be wonderful. So I'll just start having a look at what we've got in there so far. Some of them have been answered as we've gone along. Thank you for that, Tiana, but I'll read some of those out as well, because people might not have seen those answers. So we've got one about a particular species here that you might be able to answer, one of you. You've covered included a picture of a pyracantha, but Sarah asks that she's seen those cut really tight and clipped, and yet they still flower or fruit annually. Are they sort of an exception to the rule in terms of the thing about the cutting back close each year? On pyracantha, are they? Pyracantha
is one of the few that does flower despite really tight management. It does flower in slightly different ways, but even so, the more second year wood, more third year wood you get on them, the greater the flowering that will happen. And it's probable that there is still some second and third year wood that you're not necessarily noticing. Okay,
yeah, okay, good. Someone's put one here, and Tiana looks like she might be about. Oh, Tiana's going to answer live. Tiana, do you want to answer the one from Jessica, which is it possible to grow hedges in pots? Is there a minimum soil depth or type?
I mean, I'm sure John can also help me out, because I'm not a horticulturalist as much as I suppose he is, but I would say yes, definitely. You can buy. You saw in one of my pictures from the experiment, we grew our hedges in massive containers, which were tub-like, which were about meter wide, half a meter deep, half a meter. So 1 by half a meter, so in about 50 centimeters, that's just under 2 feet, I suppose. The longevity of such arrangement is probably less than if you plant it in the ground, and there's a point to which you will be bonsaiing it a little bit. But I think if you have no other option, if you need to use it as a screen on the balcony in city, or where you don't have much space otherwise, I would say definitely go for bigger containers that are available. And you can also buy some ones which are not plastic, which are biodegradable, which are like big carry boxes where you just plant some.
Okay.
And I've seen some of the big horticultural nurseries have big pre-grown hedges that you can almost buy by the meter, and they will just slot into spaces. I wouldn't necessarily recommend those for many circumstances, because you've got to have a very specific space. But actually, the most amazing thing I've ever seen is the National Hedgelaying Association have bonsai hedges of all the different hedge laid shapes. And these bonsai hedges are about this size in pots. So you can have a hedge, a fully formed, fully functioning hedge that's almost this size. So yes, you can definitely have a hedge in a pot, but it does take a bit of work. Matthew's also raised a question about putting in diversity, and you're absolutely right, Matthew. We've talked about the hedge rather than necessarily the boundaries of the hedge and the adjacent elements of the hedge, but that is as important to the wildlife of an area as the species themselves. The more rich the bottom of the hedge, the messier the bottom of the hedge, the more species you've got, the greater the opportunity for insects and other life to thrive. So a messy bottom to a hedge is definitely a positive asset. And that means having as many herbs and herbaceous plants and things at the bottom of your hedge as you can get.
And then also, yes, as you say, John, the diversity. I mean, here I focused for impact on some particular species, which are, examples of the traits that I wanted to highlight, hairiness and large canopies and sort of thirsty plants. But I think our recommendation to our members is generally, think, diversity, think perennial, so obviously hedges are perennial and that's a huge advantage. So, the management is smaller and therefore environmental impact is smaller. And yeah, so basically, yes, a diverse mix, perennial planting, and also for a lot of situations, mix of evergreen and deciduous, because that mix would then, evergreen plants would give you this year-round protection against issues, noise reduction or air quality improvement. But then deciduous, the ones that drop the leaves, when they are in leaf, they are that little bit more active. So hawthorn mixed in with holly, for example, is an interesting combination, or with something else to give you most in all seasons of the year in terms of environmental services.
Okay. Great.
Alan Charlton's asked one about edible hedges. Should we do that one?
Yeah, go on. And then there's another one where I was going to merge two questions together next after this one, John. Go on. Yep. So you want to do Alan's first? Yeah.
So Alan, yes, there's lots of stuff. We had a project, Tree Council had a project a few years back, well, for 5 or 6 years, which was called Hedgerow Harvest, which was looking at how we used urban hedges for food production. And we've had some spectacular success in planting fruit hedges in various parts of the country in urban places. The one in Portsmouth that I showed you was a fruit hedge planted along that school boundary to provide the kids with opportunities to pick stuff. And there's a whole load of resources that we created as part of that, which I'm not sure where the website sits at the moment, but we will be having it as part of the Hedgerow, Close the Gap information that will be coming out over the next few months. But that information was that you can plant, and you can plant stuff for fruit, and wild plum is a surprisingly valuable plant to add to almost any hedge, because it provides a really good dense hedge, but it also provides enormous numbers of fruit, and damson's the same. So I would suggest putting damson and plum into almost any hedge I've ever planted over the last 10-15 years, because they really do provide a massive opportunity for food as well as providing for a good hedge.
Okay, great, thanks, John. And we've got two questions about species that are getting planted in hedges. So Judy has mentioned about, is Photinia, red robin, going to be the new Lelandii problem coming up in terms of a hedge plant, because it's getting planted a lot, and how do we persuade people to plant more diversity and away from the same plants? And Sarah has asked about housing developers and the fact that they are often planting hedgerow plants that are not necessarily the best ones when it comes to biodiversity. So things like cherry laurel and Photinia are often planted very close together, close to new homes. What is being done by us as the Tree Council or by others in terms of influencing what developers are planting on new developments. So I've put those two together because they're both to do with sort of species and what's getting planted. Either of you have got any comments on those?
Do you want to go, Tiana, or shall I?
Why don't you go first?
Okay, so one of the outputs of this Close the Gap project that Louise is working on is the production of new information that starts to compile all the best evidence to provide access to the best information for a whole range of growing places. And one of the things that there hasn't been a lot of is really high quality scientific information of the sort that Tiana's been talking about, to provide that species choice. And yes, we need to work with all sectors of the industry about making sure that species that are planted are the right species for the right place, and that they don't become the next major problem because people are just planting what they think is a good idea. And there will be a whole website of resources that comes out as part of this project over the next year that will start to answer some of those very questions that both Sarah and Judy have asked. And we are working to provide best information so that people know the right species to place in the right, the right species to plant in the right places. Right tree, right place, right hedge, right place. It really matters. And we've got to get that information out there and available to everybody. And it hasn't been, as obvious until recently. And
I've added into a general chat a link to the RHS advice on choices with environmental benefits. That's the summary of this, science research I was talking about. And we have a very similar mantra: right place, right plant, right place. And we also sort of add the right purpose. So it's kind of thinking back to what do I want out of my hedge, as well as, or maybe it's, I don't know in which order you come, but you certainly need to plant something that's, will be suitable for the environmental conditions, for the soil type, or, all the obvious horticultural gardening wisdom. But then the next step is, why am I planting it? But also on top of that, I think what we are trying, I think in most situations, this general wisdom of not getting hung up on, oh my God, I just need to increase biodiversity. You will increase biodiversity with planting, quite a number of species. It doesn't have to be one or two, or what do I do for, to increase cooling or to reduce flooding. A lot of species will do that. So I think that that's an important thing to bear in mind, not to get lost in detail and plant diversely. But how do we do it? I don't know. What we do at the RHS end is really, we just keep shouting and getting involved, and not, maybe shouting is not the right word, but talking about things, using different channels, talking to people directly, website, programs. We're talking to BBC at the moment to try and commission a program on our science, where hopefully that will have some influence, partnering with the guy, with you guys to spread the word. So I don't know if anyone from the audience has any more specific ideas that we haven't considered, please tell us.
And I have the privilege of being the chairman of a group called Hedgelaying, which is the national expert group on hedges, and we are always thinking of new ways of packaging information for all sorts of markets. So we will explore that thought that was raised by Sarah and Judy there, and see what we can do following on from today. So thank you for that.
A quick practical one that Sarah's also asked whether, as we make all this information available, is it going to be free of charge, or are people going to have to pay for that? It's all going to be on publicly accessible websites that everybody can access. So that will be available to everybody.
Sarah Vaughan's asked an interesting one, if I can.
Yes, yeah, go for that one, John. Yeah.
So Sarah, you've asked the question about whether a hedge should be retained at a particular height because the local authorities suggest that that's what it should be, and then whether you should allow it to grow up and maybe coppice it every few years. And rejuvenating a hedge by coppicing it is a really good way of keeping it thick, keeping it bushy, keeping the opportunity. Obviously, in that moment, in the years immediately following coppicing, you've lost an element of your hedge, but it will regrow usually quite fast and fill in the gap. So managing hedges in that way is not necessarily a bad thing. There is a PR exercise that needs to go around it, because you've got to explain to people that you haven't just killed the hedge. It's part of a management cycle that's going on for that hedge. But as long as you get your comms right and you explain what's happening, then it can be a good thing. And laying hedges, and somebody's just stuck that, Steve has stuck, laying a hedge is a really important part of the cycle of a hedge as well in many parts of the countryside. And tonight we're doing another session with an incredible hedge layer called Nigel, who will be talking you through the whole process of hedge laying. So if you want to find out how to manage hedges in a really practical way, come and join us this evening, because that one this evening is going to be packed with really good practical management information.
And of course, we can lay hedges in towns and cities as well as the countryside. So yeah, I've seen laid hedges around somebody's front garden once. It looked just in an urban area, it looked amazing. So yeah, hedgelaying everywhere. So yeah, Nigel's going to be great tonight. So if you have a chance to book onto that one, or you'll that'd be great. Okay, which one do you want? Which question should we have next?
Anthony's asked one about environmental land management.
Yes, that's a good one. Yeah.
So that's one of the really big questions, Anthony, going forward, is how are we going to encourage farmers to look after their hedges, and the whole of the new the post-Brexit new agricultural system, payment systems, and ELMS as part of that is going to be truly vital in terms of the way the countryside is managed. So we are making strenuous representation that hedges and the way they're managed features properly, heavily and correctly in those schemes. Because if we get that right, there is a wonderful opportunity to encourage local farming communities to manage their hedges in maybe different ways than they're doing at the moment. And that opens up a huge range of opportunities for landscapes to change right across the UK. So we are fully involved in those discussions, Anthony. And we fingers crossed that we all get it right, because that will result in differently managed hedges across quite large areas of the UK.
John, while we're on sort of agricultural hedges and the management side, have you spotted there's a question from Alison at the top of the list here, on asking whether farmers get financial recompense for cutting their hedges, and is there any legal protection for hedges? And I know this is a question that we get asked a lot actually at the Tree Council about urban and rural hedgerows. So could you just maybe say a little bit about that, John, because that makes sense.
So they don't get recompense for cutting their hedges. Ironically, they get recompense for not cutting their hedges. Currently the agricultural systems, the payment systems pay farmers to not cut their hedges every year, but to cut them every second or third year. And that is designed to get people away from this annual cycle of cutting. And we've touched earlier on why that may have been the case, and I still have problems with that regular harsh cutting back of hedges on an annual basis. And yes, there are legal protections of hedges. There was work done to create hedgerow orders, which are there to be used for protection of hedges. The hedge has to qualify under various legal conditions, but if you go into DEFRA's website or the HedgeLink website and have a look for hedge protection, you will find hedge protection orders which exist and can be used. And there's a comment there from Steve that I can't see what that one was. What was that? But it was related. Yes, and there's also there are also stewardship payments for hedge laying as part of that. Of that agricultural support.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention there's a question from Alan Charlton about the science on climate change impacts and resilience of urban planting. And yes, that's very much ongoing. I mean, we have 2 research projects at the RHS, one on urban garden trees, and the kind of work which I do also takes this into account, but there are also a number of other groups around the world from which it can be extrapolated, and I think we're all working on summarizing and changing that information as it becomes available. Okay. I think that the key is to get together. There are quite a number of initiatives, and we do similar things. The more of us that get together, the louder the message will be and clearer, I suppose.
Yeah. So Tiana, do you think that some of that, all this sort of knowledge that's coming out of your research will hopefully eventually filter into actual planning policy and what actually happens on the ground, and particularly around new developments? How optimistic are you that might happen?
I am reasonably optimistic, because we now have, at least at the RHS, we have this system in place where, I'm doing the research, that I'm passing on that knowledge to the kind of the next, it's almost like a relay race, a colleague who is more involved in sort of talking to policymakers. Yeah. And then, so, as opposed to when I was starting at the RHS, a while ago, where that there wasn't this chain. I'm much more hopeful now that will happen. I don't think, however, that will be imminent. I think the need is there, but for us to go through all the hoops, we're probably talking a period of 3 to 5 years before, say, our plant finder has this environmental information, before our discussions with builders actually yield any change, or with the government, because I know that my bosses are talking at that level, but when we get through it is another question.
Okay, that's brilliant. So thank you. We're at the end of our slot now, so we're gonna stop there. What we will do is we will check through the questions and any that we haven't had time to answer. we will answer separately, and we'll share the answers to the Q&As when we post the recording of the webinar for everybody who's either joined or maybe anyone who joins to watch it later on. Thank you ever so much to our two speakers on and joining us this afternoon. Really interesting presentations, and obviously provoked a lot of interesting questions and thought with us all. And thank you to all our attendees for joining us this afternoon. As we said, we've still got 3 more webinars left in our Hedge Talk series, because National Hedgerow Week runs until the end of Sunday. So we've got tonight on hedgerow management and hedgelaying, really interesting one. On Saturday, we've got a session around hedgerow harmonies, focusing on birds and the birds that live in hedgerows and habitat for birds. And then on Sunday, we've got author John Drury talking about hedgerow plants and what they mean to humanity. So really good speaker there. He's a well-known TED talker. So we've still got some great gems left in the series for the rest of the week. So do join us if you can, or sign up and receive them to listen to them later if you can't join live. Thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of Hedgerow Week and have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Just capturing the Q&A before we close. Have we got anyone left on, Dom?
There's a few left.
Few, yeah. Just
Okay.
Are we going to stop the recording, Dom? And